Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, honorary members, Ahuina Ushla, I am delighted to be starting the debate tonight, one to which I've given great consideration in the particular context of HIS 250, in celebrating and marking the great achievements of the world's oldest student debating society. We considered the many ways in which the HIST has made and continues to make a contribution to student life in Trinity, and indeed to the intellectual, political and cultural life of Ireland. The history of this society, a timeline spanning from its predecessor Edmund Burke to Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, Thomas More, Edward Carson, Douglas Hyde, Owen Sheehy Skeffington and Conor Cruise O'Brien, reflects one history of Ireland over these past 2.5 centuries. They are also, each of them, undeniably among the best orators in Irish history. Men who used the power of language to change their country for better or for worse. Therefore, it may well seem counterintuitive in this celebratory occasion to propose the motion that oratory has failed democracy. I do so partly for personal reasons, because oratory has never sat entirely comfortably with me as a concept. Oratory always involves some level of a power dynamic which seems inherently undemocratic, even when extolling great democratic virtues, as if it is a veneer which needs to be pulled aside. One of these dynamics is that of gender. We just recently celebrated the admission 50 years ago of women to the HIST, an event which demonstrated how women were excluded from the debates of this chamber on the basis of sex. Mary Beard, writing in her book Women and Power, notes that it remains the fact that our own traditions of debate and public speaking, their conventions and rules still lie very much in the shadow of the classical world. The modern techniques of rhetoric and persuasion formulated in the Renaissance were drawn explicitly from the ancient speeches and handbooks. Our own terms of rhetorical analysis go back directly to Aristotle and Cicero. We're not simply dupes of our classical inheritance, but classical traditions have provided us with a powerful template for thinking about public speech and for deciding what counts as good oratory or bad, persuasive or not, and whose speech is to be given space and to be heard. And gender is obviously an important part of that mix. I mentioned this at the outset so that we can bear in mind that when we talk of great oratory, we're almost invariably talking about well-educated white men. And whatever else one would say about this subsection, it is not a group which is representative of the public at large. The remedy often offered that we should bring everyone up to an equal level of education misses the point, something which should concern all of us who are genuinely interested in representative democracy. But my main reason for speaking on the proposition this evening can be summed up as this, that I believe oratory is simply the wrong tool to help democracy in its current crisis. Of course, the starting premise for this proposition is that democracy is in some way failing. The wide proliferation since at least 2016 of publications on the future or crisis or death of democracy can seem almost alarmist at times. Of all these, David Runciman's How Democracy Ends offers perhaps the most nuanced answer, that if democracy is dying, and he does indeed believe that representative democracy is not faring well, that it will be that by the internal undermining of our democratic institutions, which we may well miss. This alarm is backed up by the facts. The latest Freedom in the World report, published in January, which measures the strength of democracy in 195 countries, notes that challenges to American democracy are testing the stability of its constitutional system and threatening to undermine political rights and civil liberties worldwide. Go ahead.
What's your favourite political speech ever by a public figure that we pretty much all know in this chamber?
By a political figure?
Yeah.
Striving to Go on the Moon by JFK. I can think of many great speeches that I absolutely adore. This is definitely not a speech about why I don't like speeches. I love speeches. I sometimes enjoy speaking in public. But what I'm trying to get at, that democracy is failing, and we, all of us, if we do care about democratic institutions, need to find ways to address those failings. And I don't believe the method of addressing that is through oratory. I believe it is through debate, yes, and discussion and conversations, but not necessarily through oratory. And I think we make a great mistake if we think that oratory is the solution. And all of us who care about the qualities of civil liberties and public freedom, freedom of expression, transparency of governance, the rule of law, should be deeply concerned about the ongoing lack of freedom across the world. And I do believe we have solutions to offer, even as a debating society, but I do think it's a grave mistake to offer up oratory as that solution. And so what is the solution? Well, as many speakers at our launch earlier noted, the use of evidence to support propositions, the ability to listen with people who we do not or do not think we agree with. These are the skills that I learned at the HIST. I believe that a better way of conducting our debates, particularly in the civic space, in our political life, which is under threat at present, is through, I suppose, what Habermas might call the ideal speech. And that is the type of speech that allows everyone with the competence to speak to take part in that discourse. And that really frees people up from their own inhibitions on the subject. How does that work in practice? Well, over the past 5 years in Ireland, we've witnessed two of the most remarkable democratic changes brought about by that exact practice. The Constitutional Convention, which led directly to the referendum in 2015, introducing marriage equality, and the Citizens' Assembly, which led to the referendum last year, repealing the 8th Amendment, are prime examples of what can be achieved by more creative forms of democracy, which really listen and respond to the concerns of citizens. And even actually more than the formal processes involved in both of those. Both the Convention and the Assembly encouraged national dialogues and private conversations, both of which are challenging and very, very difficult. Just one more minute, please. And so, as people would say, strong countries don't need strong leaders. And I think both of these quite remarkable democratic revolutions show that what a strong democracy can do is open up those transformative conversations which really bring about change through really respecting different points of view. But I would again echoing this same concept that really, if we want to save democracy, we really need to go back to the roots and go back to where people are at in their own lives. I want to end perhaps with the remarks of the greatest living orator, who I do believe is our greatest living orator, Barack Obama, who was speaking last year on the 100th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's birth. And he said that democracy, yes, can be messy, it can be slow, it can be frustrating, but the efficiency that's offered by an autocrat, that's a false promise. Don't take that one, because it invariably leads to more consolidation of wealth at the top. For all its imperfections, real democracy best upholds the idea that government exists to serve the individual and not the other way around. It's the only form of government that has the possibility of making that idea real. So for those of us who are interested in strengthening democracy, let's also stop. And it's time for us to stop paying all our attention to the world's capitals and the centres of power, and to start focusing more on the grassroots, because that's where democratic legitimacy really comes from. Not from the top down, not from abstract theories, not from the experts, but from the bottom up. And so, in the words of the greatest living orator, I am proud to propose the motion.
Oppose the motion.
Ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honoured to speak here today. I'm largely here for this, the wonderful Instagram opportunity. I'm coming to you today with three main points in oratory. I'm going to talk about how art, and almost the three aspects of oratory which I consider most important. That is brevity, evocation, and connection with the audience. I'm glad to see that since we've come back in from the reception, there's a lot more young people, because previously I thought that Instagram joke was not going to go down well, but now it does, so it's all good. So today I'm going to talk to you on populism and economic anxiety. I'm going to talk to you about evocation, and I'm going to talk about egalitarianism and connection. So to begin with, I think one of the easy things today is to look at the likes of Donald Trump, to look at Brexit and the ease with which someone like Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg can make a little soundbite, and that can go far. The ease with which we can say X amount of euro on the back of a bus, and that can go far. Sterling. Well, I mean, it's a lot more in that now than it was back then, anyway. And I think that a lot of that comes down to, and I think it was touched upon in Ursula's speech, was this kind of idea of like being able to get back to the grassroots. Whereas in today's politics, we see a lot happening in terms of the failure of neoliberalism, the failure for politics to actually represent the common person. And what happens then is you have economic anxiety. What happens then is because we don't, because corporations, because the 1% is benefiting from our political system, it's very easy for groups like UKIP, for people like Donald Trump, for people like Nigel Farage, to say things that just incites that fear of something else, and to be able to go, oh, this is the problem. And it's very easy to give that simplistic solution. Ah, feck, I forgot to time myself. Anyway, it's very easy to do that. And I think that's where brevity comes in. The ability to say things in a short and concise manner to get your point across easily and quickly. I think that the reason that we've struggled so far of late is that we have a lot of technocrats in power. We have a lot of people like Emmanuel Macron. We have a lot of people like Mario Draghi or members of the ECB who they know a lot. They know so much, but their ability, no thank you, you're on the op, get off. They know so much about these things, but their ability to actually translate that into something that the average person, the average voter can actually understand is very limited. And I think that is one of the big failings of this, today's politics. When we say that, oratory is like failing, we say that oratory, I'd like to say oratory is a tool, and I say that people are failing to use it correctly. The people who are using it correctly are currently in power, and I think that the problem is that the actual politicians that we want in power aren't using it correctly. There is a tendency, especially for example, the Democratic Party in the States, to take the moral high ground as opposed to actually getting down and dirty like the Republicans tend to. So to move on to my second point on evocation, why is it so important? The way we frame our debates today is important. The way we take what is happening and how we phrase it matters so much. If you take the example of after the San Bernardino shootings, Barack Obama gave a speech. And as analysts watched what was happening on Google, as they watched what was happening on social media, and as Obama talked about taking the fight to ISIS, taking the fight to Islamic State in Lebanon, etc. What happened was there was an increase in the amount of people looking up Islamic terrorism. There was an increase in the amount of people looking for these sort of making these searches on Google. And at the end of Obama's speech, he started to talk about modern, everyday heroes in America. He started to talk about the Muslim firefighters, the Muslim, the everyday Muslims who live in America. And what happened was that the actual Google search data changed. What started to happen was that people were searching for Muslims who were firefighters, etc. And it's that demonstrates the importance and the ability to frame what we are talking about. Ursula brought up Obama as well, and I say that is an example of how oratory can be used for a force for good in our democracy. I think the problem is that we currently don't see it, or we currently don't see a lack of that. Yes?
So your contention was that Obama, in that speech, managed to defeat and repulse Islamophobia, as can be plainly seen by the course of American history the next few years afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's a very easy argument to make. Like, we live in a 10-minute news cycle. Like, it's very, like, as in, I think in today's world, you do have to accept that, you know, Donald Trump is a prime example of this. Every 5 minutes there's a new scandal, but they get forgotten. It's very easy to say, oh, you know, this one thing, but that one thing did change that discourse for that moment. And I think that's what it is about today, is being able to change that discourse. No, thank you. So to move on to my final point in terms of egalitarianism, what I'd like to say is that, like, the ability to have brevity, the ability to connect with people is not something that is solely intrinsic to people with higher education. That is not something that you have to have gone to Trinity or you have to have gone to Oxford to be able to achieve. I think that if you look at the likes of Emmanuel Macron, for example, he has failed to connect with the French people. If you look at the likes of Leo Varadkar, he has failed to connect with the Irish people. And I think that is where the problem lies. I think that there is I don't think there is an actual issue whereby egalitarianism is affected by oratory. Just to get on to, I think one of the things that did upset me about Ursula's speech was when she started talking about how, you know, oratory favours men. When I think of the great oratory, like, people in the Hist in the past few years, it's definitely not me, as you've probably noticed from my absolute talk. The people who I remember are Sally Rooney, Lorna Staines and Catherine Pacifica, who were wonderful oratory speakers, who had such a way with words, and when you listened to them speak, you actually paid attention. I think of all the people who I actually listened to in the Hist from that time, it would have been those people, as opposed to any... Come on, man. Like... So in closing, I think my main point here today is that oratory hasn't failed democracy. It is that the politicians who should be using oratory correctly have failed to use the tool, as Ursula phrased it herself. They've failed to use the tools that they have at their disposal, and that is how oratory has, like, you know, that's how this motion has come about. It isn't that oratory has failed democracy, it is that we have failed to use oratory, and we have failed to use it correctly, and for that reason I would beg you to oppose. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Mr. Acting Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be here to second this very true motion, and I will take a slightly different tack from Ursula. For slightly obvious reasons, I don't think it would be helpful if I continued the line of noting that oratory is largely the privilege of white men, because it might not look good, maybe just even from an optics point of view. Instead, I will start in the usual tradition of these sorts of things by rubbishing the arguments we've heard so far from the opposition. So Mr. Miller-Hassett seemed to be giving a very confused case. First of all, he said, well, you see, the problem with democracy is that we're just not using it right. I think this is generally the tack. So probably in oratory, it's not using it right. I think this is the tack we're going to get from the opposition, which is a bit like, you know, saying, you know, in the case, now in the housing crisis of Dublin, it's a bit like saying, well, you see, the problem isn't with the houses or the lack of them, because it's with us, because we're not going and living in all those nice ghost estates. We just need to go out there and use it a bit differently. It's a bit like the person who, you know, when you're trying to move large objects around your house and it gets stuck in the door, and you realise that it probably isn't going to get through. Opposition seem to be the ones here today going, no, you just need to push harder. The problem isn't with the object or the pushing, it's that you're not pushing hard enough. And I think that tack is going to go fair, because ultimately democracy, much like a housing system or anything else, oratory is a tool. And it's a tool that's meant to serve us. I mean, what is oratory? Not to do this terrible thing going, what even is this? But yes, I will do that. Oratory is words. It's words and how we use them. And how we use them for a particular end, that is to motivate action in the political, legal, and societal sphere.
Question.
And we can't, no, not now. We can't say, oh well, this thing we have that's meant to serve us, that's meant to help us, that's meant to direct and order our democracy. Well, we're failing it. We're failing this tool. The tool is meant to aid us in doing this. And I think it's very obvious to see why, because you can say there, oh, well, if we were only to focus a bit harder or pay attention a bit more. The very problem of our society right now, the very problem Oratory fails to address, is that it can't keep our attention. It can't make us listen. It can't give us that argument. And to the extent that it makes us listen to the wrong things. Oratory always holds with it a careful balance between argument and emotion. And ideally it aligns reason and emotion, not just making us agree with the argument put forward, but in that slippery, delicate sort of metaphorical sense, moving us not just to agree with it in our heads, but in our hearts. Yes, Stewie.
Well, how do you get people to engage with democracy and institutions without people offering positive cases or oratorical arguments? How do you get people in there and engaged in the first place?
Well, I mean, that's like a bit going. That's like a bit going. Look, the car here is broken, and Oscar goes, "No, it isn't." I mean, how else would you get someone without a car? It doesn't defeat the fact the car is still broken. It doesn't defeat the fact that people aren't engaging with it, and that the thing that's meant to make them engage with it isn't working. Because the one thing democracy does now, the one thing that Oratory does now, the one thing it can do is make us listen to the very worst sorts of arguments, to make us listen to the very worst sorts of things, to make us think only of, as it were, the meme. And I don't just mean that in the context of actual, internet memes. I mean in the idea that so much of our modern politics is about the soundbite, is about the feeling, is about the illusion. It's not about the argument. So to the extent that democracy produces anything, it produces not just the soundbites, the Blair era, but the sort of, for example, Mr. Zenhauser tells us that the one people who are using democracy right now are the people who are in power, and makes that sound like a bad thing. Well, in that case, we agree that that Oratory is giving us very bad people in power, because they're the ones who are using Oratory. No, thank you. Trump's incoherence is a strategy. It appeals to people. It gives them the sense, but not the argument, the semblance, but not the concrete. And if they want to tap that and agree to it, no thank you, they want to tap that and agree to it, well then they're surely saying that the only sense which will pay attention to that is that. I mean, if you think, for example, of maybe 100 years ago, in 1905, a great statesman then, let's say F.E. Smith, who was elected, might make his name by giving that great speech where he, in response to the Liberals' overwhelming majority in 1905, he warned the government, and repeatedly warned them in his great speech, that they were going to misuse this power, and made such a name for himself. And if we think of a comparable figure today, say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, does she make her name by giving a speech, or by dancing in front of her office online? And I say that not to impugn Miss Ocasio-Cortez. I say that not to impugn her. It probably is the best thing to do is to dance in front of your office on Instagram to get the likes, right? And to get attention. And that is how people appeal to them. But surely then you've conceded that the Oratory, that the appeal of today can't work. It can't deliver that sustained argument. So thank you. Because ultimately our attention spans have grown too short for it. We no longer will sit wrapped in debates for several hours, except perhaps in this particular place. And strange people we are, let's not forget that. But that's the thing. Democracy today has become, in this school of orators, which was famously described upon the last time the HIS celebrated its founding. In this school of orators, oratory is likely to become merely a game. Merely something we can all go and say, this person did very well at it. This person did debate. And it can be a fun game. I enjoy, why am I here? Why are we all here? Apparently we seem to enjoy this sort of thing. But ultimately a game divorced from any role, purpose, or power in the public life of society. A formal argument, a speech, is not something anyone listens to or is moved by anymore. They hear the soundbite the next day. Why bother? They craft the speech around those things we remembered, about the meme or the idea that will be made from it, rather than the argument or particular thing it will hold. I think it's something we all agree is true. I think it's something which we don't particularly think that any of us are going to sit down and watch riveting speeches in certainly not our own national parliament. There they would struggle to get to the end of the sentence in a coherent fashion. But the only parliament that gives you any entertainment at all in the modern world, any kind of sense of verve and clash of ideas, is the British one. And I'm not sure, given its current struggles, it would be one we could say, well, oratory is proving a useful role. Because the thing is, and I'll finish on this, Perhaps that British Parliament right now, struggling through its various decisions and with all these votes that seem to, when you string them together, don't quite make a logical whole, perhaps that is what real oratory and real democracy look like. Messy, frightening, difficult. And that's not to apologise for it. But maybe that's something we don't really want anymore. And I don't think it is. It might hold attention for some laughs. But it's ultimately not going to convince us, to move us, to give us that moral language to fight, to decide, and to ultimately sustain our democracy. So that's why I'm very proud to propose the motion. Thank you.
Before I ask John back to speak, just to remind you all that there will be some speeches from the floor. So those of you who are being moved by the speeches this evening and would like to speak on behalf of Oratory or against it for that matter, please feel you might be given an opportunity. So now it is matter to invite John back, our esteemed Vice President and one of the most loyal members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, that this House believes that oratory has failed democracy. I'm proud to oppose the motion. Oratory is vital to all noble causes. And one of the great orators whom the Chairman and I knew so well, the great Orby MacDowell, his definition of student societies is where the young flatter the old by inviting them to speak. And I think you'll agree that's pretty accurate. Edmund Burke wrote, "When bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle." And I think the words of our founder are important here. John Kells Ingram came to this society in March 1843. He listened to a debate on 1798. The oratorical standards were so good he returned to his rooms in House 30 and wrote the great poem, The Memory of the Dead, or Who Fears to Speak of 98. They rose in dark and evil days to right their native land. They kindled here a living blaze that nothing shall withstand. Alas, that might can conquer right. They fell and passed away, but true men like you men are plenty here today. And writing later on that, Lytton Faulkner said, "For more than 60 years, this youthful burst of enthusiasm made the name of Ingram familiar to thousands of his fellow countrymen, to whom the graver effects of his measured pen could scarcely have made direct appeal." He was famous for that oratory. He was eminent in the field of economics and was elected an honorary member of the American Economics Association, which was then the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, which didn't apply in economics until 1969. But his oratory made him a public figure, and I was very pleased to hear that he'll be commemorated in Liberty Square in Thurles, where Tipperary County Council is reviving the 1798 memorial, and due credit will be paid to John Kells Ingram for inspiring people by that oratory. Isaac Butt was auditor in 1833, and in Declan Budd and Ross Hines' book, they quote his auditorial address, "From this society, great things will be produced. We will draw around us the youthful talent of our country and train them in that power which may enable them to benefit her. The glory of the days gone shall return with more than pristine splendour. I do believe that the time will come when faction shall flee away and dissension shall be forgotten, when Ireland's orators and Ireland's statesmen shall seek only their country's good, when law shall be respected and yet liberty maintained." This could be one of the themes, Mr. Chairman, for the great celebrations which are imminent. Another fine piece of oratory making the case for pluralism in this country is in the Senate papers in 1925, the great address by W.B. Yeats, using his oratorical powers, trying to stop a ban on divorce being introduced in this country. And it's one of the famous quoted pieces from the Senate record. Yeats says, "I think it is tragic that within 3 years of this country gaining its independence, we should be discussing a measure which a minority of this nation considers to be grossly offensive. I am proud to consider myself a typical man of that minority. We against whom you have done this are no petty people. We are one of the great stocks of Europe. We are the people of Burke. We are the people of Grattan. We are the people of Swift, the people of Emmet, the people of Parnell. We have created most of the modern literature of this country. We have created the best of its political intelligence. And it took us so long to have that vision realised, but I'm glad the oratorical skills of Yeats are in the Senate record, while other people set the country back from pluralism for, 6, 7 decades afterwards. Mr. Dunn.
Given that Yeats didn't actually succeed in stopping that, can we point to any example of where oratory actually did help this country for the better?
He did succeed. It took some decades. One of the pieces of oratory that's frequently quoted, Mr. Chairman, is the De Valera one on St. Patrick's Day 1943, when he dreamed of Ireland, a land whose countryside would be bright with neat and cosy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry and the romping of sturdy children, the contests of athletic youths, and the laughter of happy, which was originally comely, maidens, where firesides would be forums for the wisdom of old age. It would, in a word, be the home of a people living the life that God desires that men should live. Well, happily, I think Patrick Kavanagh and Terry Flynn were disproving that kind of idyllic countryside. De Valera did live in Black Rock and in the United States and so on, so I'm not so sure he knew what he was talking about. But the response of Sean Lemass 3 years later set the progress that this country has enjoyed to become in the top 4 or 5 countries in the world by GDP per head and reaching employment levels undreamed of. And the Master's response was, there's no such thing as the flight from the land. It is a normal and healthy feature of a national economy based on agriculture, that there should be a steady flow of manpower from rural areas to employment in non-agricultural pursuits. In fact, our problem is very largely one of attracting from the land and providing with alternative means of livelihood a substantial number of those now underemployed in it. And that you had Ireland abandoning dependence on agriculture to the De Valera degree, entering industry and welcoming foreign direct investment and becoming one of the leading places for foreign direct investment in the world, and a country with what, 2.3 million people employed, having recovered from 17% unemployment to bring that down to 5 in a short number of years. And you think of the eloquence and the oratory of Mary Robinson in winning rights for women, David Norris on attaining gay rights, Owen Sheehy Skeffington on succeeding in the abolition of corporal punishment. We needed that oratory. Idealism and oratory go together. We have examples from Ingram, from Burke, from Butt, from Yeats, from Robinson, from Norris, from Skeffington, from Lemass. Oratory inspires democracy. It hasn't failed democracy. You must oppose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barrett. I now call on Jerry Flatt to support the motion.
Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. The last time I spoke at a debate in this chamber was over 30 years ago. I was no orator then and I'm rusty now, so be nice to me. Oratory and democracy are inexorably linked and have been since the time of Cleisthenes in ancient Greece in 500 BC. He introduced democracy to ancient Greece. Oratory is an expression of free speech, which is essential to democracy. Cleisthenes also introduced ostracism, whereby tyrants were expelled for 10 years without loss of property from the city of Athens until they copped themselves on. Ostracizing some of the world's lunatic demagogues that plagued society in the intervening years would have done no harm at all. The Athenian system of government was one short-lived, due to the capture of Athens by the Macedonians in 322 BC. I will move on now from the ancient Greek history. In support of this motion, I contend that successful government leaders are by nature accomplished orators, in that they have strong ideas and are persuasive. These orators gain a following via their persuasive oratory. As support grows, so does power. The democratic process is used as a tool to achieve power. Power leads to corruption. Even the most idealistic orator eventually believes their own hype and becomes a demagogue. The demagogue establishes his or her, usually his, position, and democracy is undermined. The voting masses are subjected to clear but meaningless oratory, i.e. empty promises that feed off people's fears and prejudices. The obvious example of demagoguery and oratory failing democracy is the rise of Adolf Hitler. He was a mesmerizing public speaker and came to power via the democratic process. Hitler was also in the right place at the right time. Germany was in an economic freefall and still reeling from the loss of the First World War, a former superpower on its knees, the perfect launch pad for an orator with a clear, albeit warped vision. Lebensraum, conquer the neighbours and eradicate the Jews, and life for the German people will be great again. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's hard to believe, standing here today, that the people of Germany fell for this, but they did, and the result was catastrophic. In addition to oratory, despot leaders have the key component of narcissism. This is the key difference, I think, between good and bad leaders. To develop my argument, I'm going to use the lesser-known example of Father Charles Coughlin from Detroit, who lived there in the 1930s. This man was a Catholic priest who started out on a children's radio program in Detroit in the 20s. He had a pleasant Irish accent that the radio audience enjoyed listening to. Over the following decade, he became the original shock jock and used radio to spread his own ideas on religion and politics. He was entertaining and persuasive. Oratory at its best. The radio priest was on a roll. He became popular all over America. Radio at that time was the only source of mass, immediate communication. However, he was a narcissist and believed in his own hype. So much so that he saw himself as the future president of America. It was at this stage that his narcissistic streak came into play. In 1934, he set up his own political organisation, the National Union for Social Justice. Sounds noble? No. Sounds sinister and familiar? Yes. Coughlin actually saw himself as the American equivalent of Hitler or Mussolini. He had about 500,000 followers. He couldn't run for president himself because he was born in Canada. So he ran his own candidate, this guy called William Lemke, against Roosevelt in 1936. Coughlin's narcissism knew no bounds. The nominating convention voted in a motion to declare Coughlin to be the greatest American of all time. He proposed this motion himself. But all is not lost. FDR put a stop to his gallop with his own oratory skills and clever use of radio. Also, Coughlin's followers were not interested in Lemke, who they thought saw as a puppet. They wanted the real thing, Father Charles Coughlin. His message was clear and emotive, anti-Jew, anti-communist. He appealed to the cat. Yes?
What's your favourite oratorical speech of all time?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. He appealed to Catholic, Irish and Italian immigrants. He stirred up prejudice in the same way Hitler did. This brings me to my final example of oratory failing democracy, our pal Donald Trump. This man had all the qualities I have discussed and used them magnificently to abuse and undermine democracy. Trump uses targeted, simplistic messages that prey on the ignorance of his electorate. Trump's main weapon is the internet or social media. He is a master manipulator of the internet, the modern orator's equivalent of a loudspeaker. Trump's ability as a traditional orator were not evident during the election campaign, his own election campaign. In fact, he came across as a laughingstock. On the election trail, his message was simple and clear, though. Make America great again, just like these other guys. Keep out the foreigners and up the wages. Yes?
Why do you think that message appeals more to those people than Hillary Clinton's message?
Because it was small little bites of meaningless information. There was no detail in his message, just sound bites. He had the last laugh, though, because he was elected. Democracy failed by oratory in the form of public speaking of a weird sort, internet messaging and advertising, and he keeps it all going today via Twitter and fake news. I propose the motion.
Presentation. So now it's my pleasure to invite Stephen James Barr.
Can we swap this for some reason?
I see. Well, is that a fake move or what? All right. You, Oscar, Tui, honorary member to oppose the motion.
I'd like to thank everyone, the Chair, the House and the floor for having me here today. I'd like to thank Stephen for that fine introduction that have always certainly raised expectations just so that I can dash them once again. I'm going to talk to you today about why oratory is a positive message and we need to engage more with it. I'm going to challenge, first of all, Will Dunn and his crazy ideas that somehow oratory is distinct from democracy in some crazy way, because it's not the case. We need oratory and democracy to go together. They are a symbiotic relationship, and you cannot have democracy without oratory. The two go together. To put this in terms Will would understand, it's like a car without a steering wheel, a cat without legs, or a joke without a punchline. Rule of threes. So, the fact is that democracy only works when we engage with ideas, when we actually talk with people. Because otherwise we may as well go into a system where we elect people via the X factor or some other alternative arrangement. Because what is the point at the end of the day if we're not going to rely on people's oratorical speeches? Do we simply impose a technocrat in charge that people agree with? Well, that's not going to work. Or do we instead put up two equally qualified people against each other all the time? In which case, I guarantee you, the most intelligent and most oratorically gifted person will win every time. The fact is, we are human beings. We will always listen to oratory. So the fact is, in order for democracy to work, we have to use it. And I think the proposition on this side of the House will concede that they like democracy. In general, is a good thing. So I don't see how you can extricate the two in any real sense of the word. This is this idea, again, brought up by Ursula, that somehow we can separate oratory from the things that oratory is all about. This idea that we don't need oratory and we don't need speeches, instead we need debate. But the fact is you can't have debate without oratory. You can't have debate without some sort of system of someone giving a speech, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. The fact is, if we put everything through whatever a Google speak and spell, or whatever that equivalent is, so that everything sounds like a robot, we're still going to be drawn to what is the most seemingly intelligent, even if it isn't intelligent at all. Because we are very limited in what we can actually achieve as human beings, the virtual knowledge that we can assimilate, and we have to make decisions based on something other than, I know everything, but I don't know everything. I know some things, and I know I like the cut of that man's jib. And that's why we end up doing it. The fact is that for democracy to work, we need oratory. And oratory can do good or bad things. Democracy can be positive, oratory can be positive or it can be negative. It can lead to terrible things and it can lead to good things. Now, I think most people in this room would sort of contend that right now there are those in the world who are leading us to bad things or things that people in this room don't agree with. But it's not the fault of those people. It's not Nigel Farage's fault because he's a good speaker, or it's not the fact that Donald Trump is able to command an audience. It's the failure of those around the thing to propose a clear alternative message, something that's positive and something that will actually bring people towards that united goal. We used to be good at this. We used to have some sort of positive vision back in the early 2000s as to what the future would be. We used to have speakers, be it Tony Blair, be it George Bush, be it Bertie Ahern even, people who could command some sort of level of things are going to get better. They proposed a positive message, which is something that has been lacking for a long time from moderates. There's been no positive message for a long time, which has allowed people on both sides of the thing, I'll take Oisin in about 2 seconds, has allowed people on other sides to engage in these things. Nigel Farage offers us a very simple message. There are too many foreigners, if we get them out, we've solved the problem. It's simplistic, but the fact is no one is providing a better alternative than that at the moment for some strange reason, and that's crazy to me. Yes?
Do you think the era of Instagram and Twitter, the capacity for actually develop argumentation or
Absolutely right, Oisin. Thank you for bringing me right into my second point. The fact is that with these new technologies, we need to engage with them, because what has happened is a huge, massive retreat and a failure to engage with these technologies. These technologies are what has changed the thing. The fact is we now have far more access to Oratory than at any other point in our history. Before, you would have to go through a newspaper or the television. You'd maybe get your news once a day. Now we're constantly bombarded with it. We're updated on our phones whenever we want it. We can be as engaged or disengaged we want it. We live in our own little social media bubbles, so we only see the news that we want to see. We only end up getting specific little sound bites. But the fact is, we're still seeing far more than we could ever have done in the past. And the people breaking through on that are the people making those strange right-wing or left-wing suggestions. Whether you believe it, to put it very simply, whether or not you're listening to Ben Shapiro owning the libs for 5 minutes, or you're listening to people chanting for, oh, Jeremy Corbyn, the fact is we're getting these messages filtered through what we want to see and what we're willing to engage with. The only way to try and challenge that is to have someone stand above that crowd, something that breaks through in that capacity and challenges that status quo, and that has happened. You get people who are offering clear, positive messages for what they would like to see in the world, but they need to be done by engaging within democracy. So what do I mean by this? We cannot have the old stalwarts defending what used to be moderate, compassionate values. Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton do not lead us into the future. They didn't provide us with a positive alternative. We have a system where the middle class is about to be completely and utterly wiped out, either by the right or the left. And the fact is, the middle class have a huge amount to lose in any of these things. This is what the older politicians used to understand. That's what politicians in the past used to understand. But they retreated off the banking crisis. They retreated into a situation where I have no idea where I'm going with this line. Yeah, I'll go with it. Right, okay. So, around 2008, when we had the banking crisis, and we had the same time the iPhone came out, people developed into us. The two are related, believe me. So, go with me on this. The two are related. At the same time, when technology was put into our hands at a stage than had ever been done before, at a time when it was more important than ever to engage in a positive message and to put forward a message that people could understand, that people could get on a platform available to them, we retreated. We do not have leaders right now who are offering the clear, positive motivations for the future, and that is a real problem. But the reality is the way to do it is to offer real solutions. So, I come to you today with those real solutions. I believe we should either do one of two things. Get rid of the internet, or I support Yang for 2012. Andrew Yang is going to deliver a positive message and a universal basic income. These two things together will bring us forth into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Nice to be here. My first speech in the chamber was actually during an on MEMS debate in first year 5 years ago, so this time we've actually got a few more on MEMS to debating, which is nice. Yeah, I was asked on Friday to speak, and I thought, yeah, it's nice to be invited back. It's nice how they're treating the on MEMS. Now on Saturday, as myself, my boyfriend and a former auditor tried to cram 200 glasses of wine, 200 glasses into the boot of a car at the request of the treasurer here, I thought, I'm not actually so sure about how they're treating their on MEMS. And we still haven't been reimbursed, by the way, so it's nice to see that the treasury department is functioning the same way that it always has. Yeah.
That only one person was asked to collect those glasses on their own, and it was sold to them as being something from IKEA.
Are you going to reimburse us, Luke? Otherwise, no.
That money has been transferred. It was a
Right. Moving on. So Oscar tells us that oratory is inextricably linked to democracy, and yes, it is, but oratory is not the preserve of democracy alone. It's a rhetorical tool, and it can be used in the service of democratic or anti-democratic ideals. Stephen, my favourite speech is I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King. I will get onto that later. Sit down. Right. Great oratory alone cannot save democracy. Oratory can be deployed just as effectively by authoritarians. Too much stock can be placed on oratory. And it cannot really be relied on to save democracy. No. The art of oratory is not. Oratory is a skill that can be learned and applied by anyone in the service of any ideals.
On that,
yeah.
is being able to apply anything, depending on your opinion, not democracy at its finest?
Well, to a point, but not to the point when that oratory is literally being used to rile people up to dismantle democratic institutions. So, going to break Godwin's law here, but oratory, Hitler's already been mentioned, and it's a good example. In the 1930s, oratory was used in the service of fascism. It was used very effectively in the service of fascism. So Mussolini as well was an extremely skilled orator. He deployed techniques such as body language, variations in pitch and tone, being theatrical, the kind of techniques we learn in the Hist. And in his case, it was in the service of a fascist dictatorship. Because oratory is not, as Oscar says actually, oratory is morally neutral. It can be used in the service of great or terrible ideas, and in some cases anti-democratic ideals, and it can be used to dismantle democracy. In this chamber, you might hear an impassioned defence of human rights, followed by someone like Stephen James Barrett questioning whether the poor have considered maybe just not being poor. No. So, speeches can be inspiring and eloquent, but we cannot place too much stock in them. Oratory is powerless to save democracy. I don't think oratory will end democracy either. Oratory will constantly be used by people both defending and against democracy. Orators rarely begin societal movements or changes. They reflect them. A premise of a lot of the speeches tonight has been based on this kind of outdated great man view, and I note actually that everyone on this side is a man, great man view of what the drivers are of societal change are. The idea that these sort of powerful individuals with an idea are what sort of drives society to change. But that's not the case. These prominent individuals, are just reflecting ideas that exist in society that have been built up amongst the masses. So, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Steve. So, Martin Luther King, it's a brilliant, eloquent, passionate speech, but that speech did not set off the civil rights movement. Rather, it was the culmination of years of activism on the ground. And even more than a great orator, Martin Luther King was a great activist, and thousands of other people were great activists, and that is what led to the civil rights in America. The speech merely reflected this current in society that had been going on already. At the other end of the scale, far-right populist speeches, they don't. People like Donald Trump, or like going back further in history, Mussolini, they don't create racist, anti-democratic ideas. They merely reflect dark ideas that exist in a dark undercurrent of society. They play on fears that have already been built up by numerous influences of society, one of which is oratory, but of which there's numerous others. There's the media, writing, medium I'm more comfortable in than speaking, really. So speeches and oratory, I'm not saying they have no influence, but I think it can be vastly overstated. They are always more of a reflection than something that creates ideas. So on that, I beg you to...
Who's going to speak next?
Stephen James.
We good? Look, oratory has had a disastrous history and one that has been mainly veiled in exclusion of people. The fact is this society has its own cross to bear, and the fact for, only 1/5 of the society's history has included women in terms of oratory. Only 1/5 of the time this society has existed, the women, 51% of the population has allowed to speak and express their views on what matters to them, and what matters to them in terms of political opinions, and what can be viewed as important, and what can be viewed as something that you consider when you're making voting decisions in terms of democracy and whatnot. That means, for most history, democracy has been a fallacy. It has been a lie. It is a lie when people like, for example, Alexander Hamilton or George Washington expressed the views that the United States would find when it seceded from Britain, when black people in those countries vote counted for 2/3 of the people, or 2/3 of that of a white person. Democracy has been a lie for many years. Only recently has it been given an actual credence to where people could vote, no, Glenn, you're on my side, come on. I'm a better debater, I can POI you if I want. Look, I think you need to reconsider where you stand and where oratory is, because I think oratory has never been in a better position. Because I have asked nearly every person I've spoke to this night, what your favourite speech is by a public figure. And every single person I've asked has given me a man as their answer. No one responds to the speech. No one really regards the speeches that we've heard in modern day that have given much more credence to much more leverage to what a better democracy looks like. Because I say a better democracy looks like the people that Pop wanted Labas, like people Alexandria Cortez, people like Michelle Obama, and people like Elizabeth Warren have given, to give a more democratic view and a more pluralist view of what the modern society should look like. Because people have said they're JFKs, they're Martin Luther Kings. They have said wealthy white, in the vast majority of cases, they have said wealthy white people. I would say the majority of people consider great orators in terms of Winston Churchill, in terms of JFK, in terms of Roosevelt, have came from a situation of war. For example, Winston Churchill, literally his best speeches are regarded as, we should go bomb them Germans, right? That's not something that gives a positive view. I would say oratory nowadays reflects more stuff of, like Michelle Obama's speech of, when they go low, we should go high, in terms of promoting a positive viewpoint on where we should project ourselves for the future in terms of democracy. They say Donald Trump is a bad example of where oratory can leave you. Hillary Clinton was a disastrous example of where oratory can leave you. She was someone that was unpersuasive and didn't appeal to mass amounts of people. They say that oratory has failed people. I would say people have failed to use oratory to appeal to people, because Hillary Clinton's viewpoint to the people that were left behind by the Barack Obama administration was, the status quo is good enough, and I'm with her, right? I'm with me, and it's my turn to be president, right? Donald Trump was able to provide those people who felt marginalized of, this is a better future for us, and that's the future we should go towards. That's not necessarily oratory failing, it's people failing to use that tool, right? Because I wanted to ask the POI, no one would accept this POI, what's the difference between oratory and this House believes that Facebook is Facebook. You can't regulate oratory, right? It's not something you can regulate. I'm sure Proposition would be more than happy to regulate what they could if they could, right, in the Democratic Party. The fact is, oratory is a tool you need to use for your own advances, and it's something that you need to take hold of and appeal to people for. The great orators are people that appealed en masse. JFK appealed to the United States sentiment of we should not really like those Soviets that much and we should get the space before them. Because that was the underpinning of the we do these things not because they're easy but because they're hard speech. I think Martin Luther King's the only exception these guys can actually came this week because he's the one who spoke against Green and what we should believe in. But even then, they were largely stump speeches in terms of where we should be doing. Yeah, go, Will.
So if the only examples people can think of great orators in the past are being in the past, and the only examples that you can think of today of people who use oratory are all bad, doesn't that mean that oratory is doing a pretty bad job now, or as you might say, it's failed?
No, that's where we get you, right? Because oratory's never been more diverse in the time of the soundbite. It's people like Emma Gonzalez that speak out when the Parkland shooting happened and they're giving a global platform to what it was like to be a school shooting when your friends were massacred to death by the lack of gun control. It was people like Malala that are able to now speak out on a global platform when she was shot in the head for wanting to get an education as a woman. It is people like Michelle Obama explaining what it was like to tell your children that the house you were growing up in was built by slaves, and that is something that was incredibly upsetting to you, and that when people go back to the lowest common denominator, that you will take the high ground against them. The fact is, oratory has never been more accessible. They've told you a list of white people and wealthy African-American people, and now one example of Martin Luther King, because that's the only example that we were ever given towards a great orator of that caliber. Those people were sidelined. Those people who were different were sidelined and never given that opportunity. At the moment, it exists where you can get an opportunity as someone that is marginalized. That means, yeah, go for it.
Can I say though, people whose jobs it is these days to speak day in day out, i.e., the House of Representatives in the States, the British Parliament at the moment, those people have failed democracy, because the great examples that you gave of the high school shootings in Florida, the House of Representatives, the paid orators, have failed to listen.
That's not the concept of oratory failing. That's people that feel they address what people care about, right? The fact that when Hillary Clinton stands up and calls a bunch of people that have felt sidelined for decades a bunch of deplorables isn't the oratory field, it's that she failed to address the concerns that those people have and the fears that they have. Because when your mortgage is foreclosed and you fear that you're going to lose your house and you're going to lose your jobs through renewable energy, being called a deplorable isn't something that motivates you, but being given a simple answer is. Hillary Clinton failed to provide people with an answer. Like, genuinely go back and look at any Hillary Clinton speech and say, does that provide an answer to middle America? It probably doesn't. The European Union done a terrible job. It came across as elitist in defending itself. The European Union is a good idea, but it also excludes the vast majority of the other world and has aggressively neo-colonial policies towards Africa, for example, and it crushes their agricultural industry. The fact is, what we feel is the bastions of model civilization have failed to appeal to the people that have left behind. And orators like Donald Trump have appealed to those people. It isn't that oratory has failed, it's people that have failed to connect with the people that have been left behind. More than happy to oppose.
Killed to quibble to support the motion.
Mr. President, officers of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen. Over the course of listening to tonight's debate, and actually quite the diversity here in terms of how people have approached the motion, there are a few things that have made me think about really, in terms of how each speaker has looked at this in a different way, and go back as to why we're having this debate at all. And this is not a debate that we would have been having. This would not recall previous honorary members' debates that we've had a few years ago. We had one on Scottish independence, another one we had one on the death of Julius Caesar. But why was this chosen now? And could have been chosen last year, but it would not have been chosen 4 years ago, because it is now the perception that something is failing in democracy, and the democracy is failing. And so we need to think of it from that perspective. When we think about democracy, one thing that I've been concerned about from those opposing this motion is that democracy is being seen in a very reductive way simply this person is winning an election, therefore it is democratic. Now, but the democracy we're talking about as having that is suffering at the moment isn't the mere fact that is beyond the democracy is beyond the mere casting of votes. When we talk about democracy in trouble, we wouldn't talk about it if we were just talking about, because we're not seeing yet, and certainly not yet, a rise of dictatorships. We're not seeing what we are seeing in countries where except with the exceptions of situations like Hungary, where there's actually interference with the democratic system there. But for the most part, the crisis democracy is under is not that of yet a dictatorship. But we're talking about democracy as something that encompasses the rule of law, respect for minorities, and an understanding of human rights. And that is what is a threat. And that is what has been a threat by oratory. And that has failed. And when I think we think about, I think it's instructive to look to the past. And it's instructive to think about the great successes of oratory. And oratory has been useful. Because in much as it was important that there was a civil rights movement behind Martin Luther King, it did need a figurehead, such as Martin Luther King. But let's think about 1963, when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. Let's also remember the other speech on race in that year that also had a great impact, which was that of George Wallace when he was inaugurated as Governor of Alabama, when he spoke in very clear terms about segregation now, segregation forever, and how the continuing impact that had on the coming decades. And that might have been seen as the last sting there at the wasp, but that continued on, and the seeds of that continued through, and the idea of that man standing up for those who were standing against change, speaking up, is continued up to the most recent presidential election, and in a similar way. We also, when we think about democracy, when we think about oratory, we like to denigrate. It's very common here for us to denigrate what we hear in the Dáil. Because the Dáil, much as I give as Sean Barrett did say, he gave references to great speeches in the Dáil, and it's great to see great speeches. I don't think anybody here is speaking against eloquence in politics. That is not what we're against. We're concerned about what has occurred, and as much as it has not delivered. But when we look to, and we think by what House of Parliament is best known for its oratory, it is the House of Commons. And I would take the Dáil at the moment 100 times over what we're seeing today in the House of Commons. And I think we need to think carefully, and I might finish on this, but when we think about how the last two American presidents, the current American president, the previous American president, how they're both ones who were elected on the force of their words, and they're both in time much to my mind, and too much denigration of Hillary Clinton in their time. Through one process or another, they beat her to get to that position. But I think we need to look at how, as president, despite all his oratory, that Obama did not manage to bring the country forward in the way that needed to be done. We need to consider that, much as we look back to his oratory, and we need to let's be realistic about, powerful as it was, that did not manage to convince, and the people we talk about, people who felt left behind, and whether they should or shouldn't have, that was not the failure of Hillary Clinton. She had not been president for those previous 8 years. The Democratic Party had suffered in state houses and in Houses of Congress during that time period. And so that his oratory, great as it was, impactful as it was, moving as it was, and the fact that it is great that he could stand up on the many occasions, stand up at the school shootings, the church shootings. That was important, but did not succeed in making democracy stronger. And then we had one of the vilest forms of oratory managed to succeed him. And to consider both those presidents used their forms of words and the effect that had on democracy, I'm proud to support the motion that oratory has indeed failed democracy. Thank you.
And now I ask Queen Honorary to oppose the motion.
firstly, just like to say I'm using my phone right now, which will probably make for a very bad speech, but hopefully some good oratory will happen, maybe, who knows. So firstly, I just, like Oscar and Stephen already kind of repeated what William already said, but when I decided to stand up and do the speech, the moment I decided to do it was when I thought of, William done, I'm done. Like, you allude to oratory being a tool, and then you say that, oh, but it's a tool that failed us. But let's be real right now. A rock is a tool. But you can use a rock to kill someone, or you could use a rock to make a fire that could remove some bacteria from some meat, and that could literally save a life. So I feel like it's more like we humans are bad, but whatever. I'm going to go through that more in my speech. There was some mention about like kind of oratory being taken out of context. So we had Hillary Clinton being a bad orator, and we have that reference to her famous deplorable speech. Has anyone actually read that speech? Admittedly, you can't watch it, but you can read it. And I've read that speech, and to be honest, she doesn't come across as terrible as the 24 hours news cycle made her out to be. Because let's be real right now, in this age of social media, 24 hours news, that sort of thing, oratory, like what they present to be oratory isn't really true oratory, right? Because true oratory is what you're doing right now in this room. It's a very special experience where you have to listen to me for the next 3 minutes, and hopefully what I say is coherent, but mostly, like, it will make a story that you will get, and that if you took this one sentence out of my speech, that will not come across what I'm actually trying to explain to you. So I think we need to remove ourselves from social media when reviewing this, because of course social media might be failing us, but oratory in its purest form probably isn't. No thank you. So going on, I think, I really don't, Op haven't shown us how kind of democracy could work without oratory. I think really oratory is crucial in democracy, mainly because democracy, society is a massive place, right? There's a huge amount of people, more people than who are involved in democracy would be able to be held in this room. And the whole idea is simply, I can't meet and greet every single one of you to give you my trust, right? To convince you that, hey ho, I'm the person you should entrust to lead or make decisions, that sort of thing. But in oratory, I can do that, right? Like, I can't just say, hello, my name's Reed, and shake your hand to every single one of you. But in oratory, I can make a speech to give you a general idea of my views. I can't have a single discussion with every single one of you, but in oratory, I can kind of replicate that. And that's what's crucial about humanity. Like, we need, when we grow in population, oratory becomes more and more important. And in this massive 7 billion people world, we need oratory, because honestly, we can't have functioning democracy without it. Otherwise, you'll just be electing your friends or electing whoever. No, thank you, William. Anyway, I'm so sorry. Oh, this is such a mess because there's so many things happening. What's my time? Okay, great. No, thank you, William. So anyway, okay, so basically, when I started debating, I think like maybe 10 because I was in school, whatever. And I was very idealistic. Sadly, I'm no longer idealistic, but on this night, when we're celebrating 250 years of debating, I think I should probably go back to my idealistic self when I started debating, when I started oratory. And honestly, it gave me a little self-confidence and whatnot. But I think what's really important is that when we're doing oratory, we're aspiring to be something greater. It's almost like fantasy. Yes, we're simplifying things, but we're aspiring to be something greater. We're aspiring to unite people, to spread this feeling of emotion across the entire room, right? That's what we're trying to do. It's idealistic, right? And when you're being idealistic, you should view things in a way that oratory should be used for good, not for racism, not for discrimination. It should be used to unite people and make sure that we can go forward tomorrow and make sure the world is a better place. That's what oratory is about. And that's why I believe it's not failing democracy. Thank you very much.
I wonder, are there any else who would like to speak in favour of the motion?
Can I just go again?
Wrong side, Glenn.
Oh no, I can switch. So
You never played that card well.
Well, that being the case, you have heard the motion proposed and seconded. The motion is that this House believes that oratory has failed democracy. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
All those against, please say no.
No.
The nays have it.
Yeah. 2 years in a row. Like drunken rambles of one. Just like it. Just like church leaves some alcohol.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, say I'm so sorry that the Oratory Captain is not here tonight, and we wish her well.
She's
and
Angela.
it would be very nice if she had. Now, this is a wonderful motion. In fact, I read it first, I thought, like, good heavens, what's this? And then it turned out, of course, that our speakers this evening have really produced some, I think, excellent speeches and have been very provocative and very helpful. Now, I come to this with the, as I think at least one person said, the reason why we're debating this tonight is because we're worried about democracy. Now, we wouldn't be having this debate if we were not worried about democracy. And it stands uniquely, I suppose, to a society such as this, to ask, can we blame oratory, or debate for that matter, because we are a debating society, and we also, so we admire debate as much as we admire oratory. Now, one of the things that worried me about the referendum in the UK, of course, was that in the end the orators were on the wrong side. But more than that, of course, it was people who were on the right side didn't make the right kind of argument either. It was really terribly, terribly sad for me, and possibly for many of you, that this great, great institution, the European Union, in my opinion, one of the greatest achievements of the post-war world, which was rightly awarded the World Nobel Peace Prize, was not spoken of by those who said remain as something which was truly great. It was they spoke of it, and said it, picked up that way anyway, that we should be afraid to leave. But it was the consequences of leaving, the negative consequences of leaving, that we should fear, rather than the positive attributes of staying in and contributing to this magnificent cultural, political achievement in Europe. And it just reminds me then just to note, when you think of democracy in Europe, some of us here unfortunately are old enough to remember when perhaps the majority of modern European nations were not democracies. Virtually everything south, almost all the countries on the Mediterranean, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy somewhat dodgy. And the whole of Eastern Europe, knocked down. France teetered at times. Remember how delicate it was. France didn't necessarily have to end up as a democracy in this post-war firmament. And Italy likewise. The Americans and others threw vast sums of money into trying to combat communism in Italy. And remember what the communists did in Italy and what they did in France was that they fought against the Nazis. They actually deserved respect. And of course they got respect at the polls. But of course, we, that is generally speaking, when I say we, I mean the Americans and the Northern Europeans couldn't see that as necessarily a good thing, so they did everything they could to undermine them, mainly by undemocratic processes. Nevertheless, let us look back over the last, let's say, 50 or 60 years, and what we can see in this post-war world is actually the rise of democracy and the spread of democracy, the intensification of democracy throughout our societies, which has been aided today by the enormous power of social media, which we haven't quite yet learned how to deal with as a factor in the promotion and activities of democracy. So I am not ashamed, as I think maybe some people might pretend to be, the achievements of democracy. And I think of India, which I think, am I right, became independent in 1947, is that right? Here is a country of several billion people. All right, it is not a perfect democracy, but my goodness, isn't it an extraordinary achievement that that nation does change government peacefully? And that is the great triumph of democracy, that you change government peacefully. Everything else, in a way, is secondary, subsidiary. The ability to change government peacefully is the most extraordinary thing. That's a huge, and there are so many. And if you look, I mean, I've seen things go up and down, of course. So, how many of the South American countries today are democratic? Quite a few, a lot more than say 30 or 40 years. And some disappear again, and democracy decay, but it comes back. Democracy has that extraordinary capacity to rise like phoenix from the ashes. So, I'm enormously proud of the achievements of those people who have promoted democracy across the world. Now, what about the role of oratory? Well, the other reason I think that you chose the motion for debate is that the theme for HIS 250 is just a running theme: oratory and debate in the service of democracy. In other words, those of us who tried to come up with something, we recognize the challenges to democracy. I'm not saying there are no challenges. There are some very, very serious challenges. There are some, we are faced with huge setbacks in the United States, where, by the way, democracy has always been somewhat perilous, because the structure of the democratic system, so-called in the United States, is framed in 1770-something, and not really fit for purpose in the modern world. So strongly influenced by money. If you don't have money in the US, how do you succeed certainly on the federal democratic stage? So, what is the role then of oratory and debate? I think you chose the motion tonight because maybe some of you knew about this note. So democracy is challenged. And for me, at any rate, oratory has a huge place in that. Debate, likewise, and Mr. Donaldini talked about it earlier so beautifully. He talked about the importance of evidence and so on. And I really responded to Ursula Kuhl's recognition of the conventions, the public conventions, on the Constitution, first of all, and secondly on the challenges of the Eighth Amendment. Those were exemplary exercises in democracy. But nevertheless, at those meetings, people had to stand up and speak. And also, and some of them, I mean, they were, in both cases, in the second case, drawn from the general population. Maybe people who hadn't had the advantages that we've had of learning the cut and thrust of debate and oratory. And I'm quite sure that those meetings were more at a level of debate than oratory, as it were. I mean, I don't think that great oratorical statements probably cut much ice at those meetings. But nevertheless, that's the part of our democratic system, those are. So let's recognize that oratory and debate, these are fundamental to the democratic process. Even the idea of meeting and listening to a person speak, that comes out of the Greeks. But I mean, there are other societies where that would never have happened. We have been used to that idea in Western society for a very long time, of course, imperfectly, but getting stronger and stronger. The idea that people meet and hear one person speak, whether they speak with great oratorical skills or simply present ideas and arguments. So when we're talking about oratory, at these meetings, then that continues to votes and so on. Okay, the oratory is important. Now, I simply cannot accept one other thing that Mr. Quill mentioned, and that going back to the Greeks, that oratory is essentially white. When I think of the great orators, I found it difficult to think of a great white orator of recent times. I mean, certainly John Kennedy was. But I certainly thought of Obama, and I thought of Michelle Obama. I thought of Mandela. I thought of Gandhi, who spoke in a different kind of way. I certainly thought of Martin Luther King. I cannot imagine not thinking that is the greatest speech that I've ever heard. And by the way, yes, it was building on the success of the civil rights movement But remember where his oratory came from. It came from the villages, from the churches, the Baptist churches, the black preachers throughout the South. One of those people. Oratory was in the gift, it was something that the black religious experience developed to a much higher degree than anything in the white community at the time. Malala has been mentioned, and of course she's absolutely wonderful. I actually heard Hillary Clinton speak here in Trinity. Did anybody else attend her address? I have to say, I thought she spoke wonderfully well, and she had an absolutely extraordinary effect on the audience. Now, I think the people who went to see her, by the way, she was preaching to convert. They were people she was very important for. But my goodness, did she speak well. It was absolutely stunning. It was understated in a way that and it was good humor and self-deprecating. I won't say it was oratory, but my goodness, was it a very, very, very fine speech. And I want you all to know, if you haven't heard her speak, that one of the finest speakers in this country on the political stage has been our first woman ex-orator, Mary Harman. Absolutely outstanding speaker. And I've seen her speak in many different situations, but her capacity to stand up and give a great speech about a very complicated matter, for example, when she was Minister for in charge of the IDA, whatever it was called in those days, Industry and Development, I think it was, she could stand up without notes and give a cogent description of some very complicated stuff. Absolutely wonderful. Occasion, quite. Not a man. Huh? So let's be clear. I don't see oratory as the preserve of quite men. So now, where do we move today? What can we imagine? It seems to me that it is extraordinarily important that when oratory does come into things, as it did in Britain during the Leave referendum, and Farage and Johnson and so on were the orators, and there wasn't anybody on the other side to match them. That was a serious deficit. Oratory let democracy down on that certain level. But it's actually the people, of course, who were on that side. Where the wonderful mention of Father Cochrane, a chilling individual, who's a brilliant article that Fintan O'Toole and some of you may have read quite recently about him. A really, really dangerous person in the United States in that period in the 1930s, 20s and 30s. But he was actually beaten by oratory. FDR took him on. FDR used oratory to undermine that man, Father Cochrane. And this is, I think, where we have to imagine oratory has its place. What are we talking about? We're talking about the high art, not so much the high art. What is it? What is it that distinguishes oratory? It is, of course, the ability to persuade. But, of course, what we want is that people should be persuading people to think well, to do good things, to make good judgments. And we have to, of course, accept, as somebody said, that so many of the orators have not had that in mind at all. But I would put it to you that we need oratory and debate in the service of democracy. And if it has not, if those qualities together, I think of oratory and debate as being two sides of the same coin, if those things have not been brought to bear on major questions, then I don't blame it on the art of oratory or the art of debate. I blame it on the people at the time who failed to rise to challenge in the right kind of way. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Professor McConnell for concluding tonight's events, which was a fantastic address from the chair. And I'd also like to thank